Bryan Woo made his 2024 debut on Friday, pitched 4 1/3 innings against the A's. He left in the 5th inning with tightness in his arm. He wasn't staying loose during the bottom of the 4th inning, the half inning before that. So he came out after throwing 95, 96 throughout the first 4 innings. He comes out and he throws a couple of 86-mile-an-hour fastballs to Cal Raleigh, who noticed it right away, and he got pulled. But Scott Servais says he's okay. He'll pitch today when this episode comes out on Wednesday. So the question that this storyline poses, and I think you're a good person to answer this, Lyle, what are Bryan Woo's expectations in 2024?
In the simplest of terms, they're high. There's a lot of people that believe Bryan Woo's ceiling is higher than Bryce Miller's. Bryce Miller currently sits with a 2.66 earned run average. And when you're doing that, and you're talking about a guy that supposedly has a higher ceiling than Bryce Miller, yes, they're going to be high in terms of expectation. Now, Bryan Woo's not going to throw the amount of innings that Bryce Miller does. He's going to be on much more of a limit. We're going to have to look and see what Bryan Woo's improved on over the offseason, very similar to how we were all waiting to see what Bryce Miller would improve on, and the adjustments have been noticeable from his end, right? With the addition of the really good splitter, some of his breaking stuff is far, far better than it was a season ago. He's throwing more than 2 pitches. We're going to need to see some of that with Woo here, too, as we're going to dive into more of it. But in the simplest terms, yeah, Bryan Woo's expectations are high. I would think he would tell you that his expectations are high. He's a confident guy. He knows he's a good arm. I think the expectations are going to be he's going to take a big jump this year.
And we know now in Bryce's camp, we know Bryce has executed his pitch as well because he's faced a variety of lineups, a variety of strengths, right versus left, and he's been successful against all of them sans the Texas Rangers. You know, that's going to be, I think, the ultimate, final boss for both of these pitchers based on what we saw last season and based on what we saw in Bryce's one start against the Rangers this year. Shockingly, this would probably be a good week right now for the Mariners to play the Rangers, but they're going to have to wait a little bit to play the Rangers again, who are struggling right now, especially offensively. But Bryce and Bryan have not pitched very well last year or this year against the Texas Rangers, and it would be a good test to see how much their stuff has evolved. But in Bryce's case, Bryce has shown he could execute his stuff. He has executed his splitter to left-handed hitters. They struggle to hit it, and he's overall, outside of just that pitch, executed to lefties who have struggled to hit him this season. That's why I wish we had a little bit more of a sample on Bryan Woo, because it's tough to evaluate if anything really has changed yet. If you want to look at the percentages of what he did in his first start. So Bryan Woo in his first start threw 70% changeups changeups. No, he didn't throw that many changeups. 70% fastballs combined between his 4-seamer and his sinker. Last year, he threw those 2 pitches about 72% of the time combined. So that works out. It's about the same, give or take. The only real difference, which is noticeable, even though he only threw 9 of them, he threw way more changeups than he did on a rate basis last year. The changeup, it has a similar idea of his splitter. Not his splitter, of Bryce's splitter, of Logan's splitter, of George's splitter against lefties. A pitch that'll go down, a pitch that'll go away from lefties, and a pitch that's a better strikeout pitch against those. And he threw, after throwing it 4% of the time last year, threw it 15% of the time in his first start against the A's overall, and then 20% of the time against lefties. So at least we have one data point that shows strategy-wise, it feels like he's a little more comfortable throwing that pitch this year. Once we get 5, 6, 7, 8 starts in, we'll get a more definitive view. But one start in, that changeup did feel good. It did feel good. He didn't get much swing and miss on it, though, which is probably something he's aiming for.
Well, I'll say about your point with the sample size. We're not supposed to have a big sample size on Bryan Woo yet, because the point of the segment is, what do we think he'll do in 2024? After he makes 7, 8 starts, we could do another segment saying, what is our evaluation of Bryan Woo here in 2024? This is the expectation segment. And this is kind of going to be balanced into 2 parts. I know you've intertwined it a little bit, but there's the addition of a pitch and what he does against lefties. And we can break those 2 down separately. I know right now you're kind of going down the avenue of more pitches and use of pitches. So let's stay there. You're right. It seems like, at least through one start, the changeup is the pitch that he is leaning on a little bit heavier. And he's going to have to lean on something a little heavier. Bryan Woo's 2 fastballs are why people think his upside is a frontline starter. Those 2 fastballs are nuts. They're nasty. They combined for a run value of, let's make sure we have this right, 11 last year. 7 on the 4-seamer and a 4 run value on the 2-seamer. Those fastballs play. And guys have a ridiculous time picking it up between the wacky low arm angle he releases from and the crazy fastball ride that comes with it. Those are tough to hit. And the numbers spoke for that last year. But when you look at his other offerings, the changeup, the slider, and the sweeper, those got hit harder last year. So something of those 3 weapons has to take a step forward this year. Through one start, it looks like he may lean more on the changeup. And if he's going to lean more on the changeup, great. Whatever it's going to take to keep hitters a little bit more off balance.
It's going to have to be, though, I would imagine, his changeup and one of his sliders. Like Bryce like Bryan, has a good fastball. It's a different fastball that comes from a different angle and does different things. But overall, the goal for both of them is to utilize their good fastball, but not to the point where it exposes them. Because when the two of them have to throw it too much, then even good pitches can get hit, because if you see a good pitch enough times, it will get hit because these are big league hitters. So if he can work that changeup in 20% of the time against lefties, just for comparison, if you're curious. So Bryce throws his splitter 22% of the time against lefties. Logan throws his splitter 11% of the times against lefties. Though Logan has a bit of a deeper arsenal, he substitutes more of that with throwing his cutter in on the fists of lefties and helping get them out. And then George throws his splitter about 14% of the time. So all these guys have pitches they lean on a little bit more against lefties than they would otherwise in just a standard at bat. And that's, I think, where Bryan's going to have to, he's going to have to figure it out. And he said his off-speed stuff got knocked around. Yeah. And it might be figuring out this year which one of his sliders he prefers, whether it be the bullet slider or the sweeper. That's going to be, a telling time. Even if the fastball is the out pitch, you're still going to need one of those pitches that moves away from the hitter to try and be effective.
So my follow-up to that would be, if he's going to figure out which of his 2 sliders he's going to prefer, off the numbers, the bullet slider fared a little bit better than the sweeper. The sweeper got hit pretty hard last year. Guy slugged 457 against the sweeper. The run value was -5. It could have taken a big jump in the offseason and in spring training. We'll wait and see. We haven't seen enough of a sample to see which he prefers and which works better yet. But just off the numbers in 2023, the bullet sliders seem like it worked a little bit better. They're both going to have to take jumps forward. But yeah, he will probably need one breaking ball.
Right. So I don't know if Bryan Woo's ever going to really add a pitch. I don't feel like he needs to. I think the arsenal sitting what it is good enough, unless he was going to, if he was going to swap. You never say never, right? It's hard to believe now, thinking of a guy like Logan Gilbert's not a primarily fastball pitcher. Like, do you think of Logan as a primary fastball pitcher now? Even though when he came up, that was his best pitch. Not really, because he throws so much else. The same can be said for Bryan Woo. If the arm talent really is that, even if he's so gifted from where he releases the baseball, you can't rule it out of the question to think that something else might be more effective when it comes along. It might not be this year, because Bryan's still young and he's still going to have a lot of innings under his belt, and he still needs to get a lot of innings under his belt, and he's got a long way to go to get ramped up to the point where George Kirby and Logan Gilbert are right now when it comes to innings and distance and overall just command of a repertoire. We got to just contextualize a little bit. I mean, Bryan Woo only threw 80-something innings in the big leagues last year and just 131 innings total last year, right? So he's going to build on that a little bit this year. But even if he goes 20 innings past that, he's still sitting like 50 innings plus shy of where we expect Castillo. Let's throw Castillo out because he's a vet. Logan and George right now this year, when we're talking about the young guys and the guys who are still learning and growing in this rotation. So you're not going to have those 50 innings really of development for Bryan Woo, wherever those innings get subbed out this season. So it might take a little longer.
Maybe you won't have to sub him out that much, though, because if he's on a 150 inning limit and he also missed 5 or 6 starts here at the beginning of the year, maybe that essentially does it. Maybe right. they jumble around the rotation at the All-Star break a little bit to have him skip a start or something like that. But he may not have to actually go on the Phantom IL or anything like that this year just to skip starts.
Yeah, he might have to. He might not have to. We'll see. We'll see how he holds up. I think that the That that question might be more to Bryce for them both pitching. Like, can they both last for, in Brian's case, 5 full months, in Bryce's case, 6 full months? Can they do it? Can they keep up the stuff? And can they, when September rolls around, can they execute? Do they still feel that way? And
right.
that is the question for both of them. But certainly, even though he essentially got the first month off, that's the question for Bryan Woo.
Miller's more built up than Woo. I think Woo is the bigger question mark there. So we'll see. I do want to highlight the left versus right here, because this is going to be the overarching theme for Bryan Woo all year. And it's the case with Bryce Miller too. There's going to be a cloud hanging over Woo's head all season, which is, can he consistently get lefties out? That's the key. Let me read you these numbers in 2023. Here's what Bryan Woo did against right-handed bats. He put up a 264 FIP, 285 xFIP. He was striking out 10.5 per 9, walking 1.5 per 9, and hitters put up a 495 OPS against Bryan Woo. That's pretty damn good, right? Here's what he did against lefties. 665 FIP, 614 xFIP, 8.3 strikeouts per 9, 5.5 walks per 9. Hitters put up a 928 OPS against Bryan Woo. In simpler terms, all in a nutshell, against righties, he was a Cy Young winner. Against lefties, he wasn't a big leaguer.
Yeah, that's going to be the question. And that's where, when we look at his first start against the A's, that's where we try and find something from what we've seen so far, because something has to be different. And at least in one start, it was like 1 for 8, right? 1 for 8 against lefties. Mm-hmm. The A's stacked lefties in their lineup all weekend against the Mariners' right-handed starters, and the Mariners did perfectly fine against those lefty bats and against, Bryan Woo and, Bryce Miller also, who's been very good against lefties this season, as already mentioned. But the first test against lefties, he did not get crushed.
Mm-hmm. Which is great.
Yeah.
That's a huge step. Again, Woo doesn't have to put up the numbers that he puts up against righties against lefties. It just has to be manageable. If Bryan Woo's going to be much better against righties in his career because his fastballs are his best pitches, great. That's his strength. You just can't get absolutely lit up against left-handed bats on a consistent basis. He's just got to find a way to neutralize it a little bit. If that 928 OPS that opposing hitters put up against him last year can come down to somewhere in the 700s, let's call it 750, then exactly what we're talking about Bryan Woo's upside being a frontline starter, he becomes a frontline starter if he does that.
So July 1st, Lyle, let's circle back. Let's see see where then we can do a proper evaluation. It'll be 2 full months of starts for Bryan Woo, and we can make a more comfortable assertion whether or not something has changed or not.
Definitely. And I'll wrap up with this, because as I've talked about on this podcast, I love to watch Bryan Woo pitch. He might be my favorite guy in the rotation to watch pitch, because the idea of what he can be is really exciting. And everything we just talked about, let's end it with this. His Savant page last year was a ton of red. His xERA was 3.48. This guy, as we've talked about, has 2 fantastic fastballs, is hard to pick up for hitters. There is so much about what he does and the pitch arsenal that he possesses that says he can be awesome. So let's see what he does here in 2024, because truthfully, again, I think his ceiling is very high, and do not be shocked if he ends the year with an ERA in the low 3s. And I'll leave it at that. I genuinely believe that.